So thank you everyone for coming and attending my talk. I can see a bunch of my students that are in the audience as well, which is really nice to see. So I'm going to talk about how computer artists are just scraping by in both the sense of the profitability that an artist usually deals with. Normally we're dealing with, the starving artist syndrome. But also that, it's scraping a bunch of images. So I've newly joined into TRU. I'm really pleased to be here. My background is out of the side of computer science. So beforehand, I was over in Ontario at Brock University and the University of Guelph. I moved over into manufacturing inside of Mag International. So I did defects on car bumpers for a year. And I decided, you know what, I'd rather go back into teaching rather than have to actually make money. And from there went on to be a visiting researcher at ITU Copenhagen, working with their games development lab. And for 7 years I was over in Russia as an assistant and then associate professor and head of the AI in games development lab. And you might understand why I left. So this is all about kind of the idea of why AI for art. So humans have really had this need for kind of a reproduction of what we do as being something that we want to see within computers. And so this is the whole formulation of the Turing test and why we're interested in all of this, to create this kind of generalized artificial intelligence. But the history of this goes even back before this. Inside of Greek mythology, there were these creations of gynoids and of something that's like a man. And usually this is also a more perfect man, something that doesn't have the flaws that we have. And this is met with then some sort of hubristic folly for the creator, trying to do something that is innately a God's domain, that is innately a human domain. Art is one of those, we would think, uniquely human activities. And so a lot of the early thoughts about AI was, if we can make an AI that can make art, much like if we can make an AI that can beat us at chess, it would prove that the AI is at our level of intelligence. I'm sad to say that, one, we do have AIs that can make something that we would call art, and I might be able to fool you, but I don't think that the AIs are at our level of intelligence. And I'm going to get through why I think that. Computational creativity is the academic direction of going through and analyzing inside of this the examinations of AIs applied to what are normally creative endeavors. So this is the plastic arts, this can also be music, this could be theater, this could be poetry, this could be chat GPT-3, which everybody seems to be bringing up. No matter which talk it is, they get a plug. And so you may ask, well, what's up with this guy who is, a computer scientist talking about art? Why should we even care? And my own background through this, I looked at it through the lens of fractals. I look at it through the lens of photomosaics. I look at it the lens through poetry. I have a bunch of publications, weirdly in poetry journals, because the poetry that was being created had mathematical illusions inside of it, and a bunch of poets came to my office and said, can you please explain to us what this poetry means? And I went, oh, it's this mathematical function. And they went, okay, we need to write a paper on this. And now I'm published in poetry journals. And also from the aspect, as I said, of games development. I did a lot of games development. There's texture generation inside of games, so it uniquely moves off into that. Mosaics have a long history. These are colored shards of pottery, stone, glass, plastered into walls. Mathematical and geometric patterns are very popular, and especially inside of Islamic art, because there's prohibitions about depicting men and animals inside of that religion in some of the areas. And so they diverted that over to nice mathematical patterns that don't look like something representative in the world. The idea of photomosaics, and you've probably seen multiple copies of these in different magazines, taking all of the covers from previous years and gluing them together. There's the Yoda one with all the images out of Star Wars, and it makes Yoda's face in the middle of it. Robert Silvers holds a patent on this process for the creation and the trademarks around it. He had a thesis that was inside of a arts degree from MIT in 1996. And the idea here is that you have a sub-picture resolution. You have both the color and the semantic channels. So the semantic channels would be like the outline of me inside of this. But the color channel would then also be what colors are my, suit coat, what colors are my tie. And so through those two channels, it's really looking at matching the color and the semantic when you pull back from it. So to make a photo mosaic is really simple. We break the images down into blocks, we take a set of photos. This could also be generated images, and I'll get into that. For each block in the image, search through the set, test against the block that you want to put it onto. This could be via root mean squared errors for our computer scientist friends. That's the algorithm. For the rest of you, via some form of magical algorithm. And then you look at this in terms of that mathematics, or structurally. There's different ways to get structure out of this. And then you just compare it and say, does it fit in this place? Okay, let me show you an example of this. Okay. Have we seen this image before?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, this is the Lena image. And there's an interesting controversy around it. It was actually scanned in from a Playboy centerfold. Yes, I have seen the rest of the image.
The articles.
I only saw the, I'm going to admit, I only saw the image. I'm not going to go that far. My last name isn't Clinton. So commonly used test image inside of graphical processing. It's a canonical test image for years. It had some great things in that it's a person's face. It's 512 by 512 pixels. Lena actually was invited to the 50th anniversary of the Society for Imaging Sciences and Technology. She was extremely flattered to have that invitation and that her image was shared in this way. Of course, claims based on where it was drawn from and the history behind it of sexism. And we don't use this image after her passing. The family asked us not to use it anymore in new academic papers. I'm showing this because I think it's very important for people to know that, first off. Secondly, I did papers that were before that cutoff date that I'm going to show you images from, but just good to know that this has been a deprecated image now. The Mandelbrot set, for those of you in the room that are mathematically inclined, is defined as a complex number set. There's some math, so half of you go to sleep now. And the idea is it just basically runs and iterates over this. It's some cool math that makes some cool images, and there's lots of images that are of the Mandelbrot set. And so what we did was, can we make fractal photo mosaics? So we took the system that creates these images, and then we placed it against our target image. So here's some different sizes of these breakups against it, and you can see up at the top we have very, very small fractals that form up the image. And here we have larger fractals that kind of blur it a bit. Okay. And if I go deeper in, these are, of course, shrunken images of what they are at full resolution. This is what it looks like more at the full resolution. And you can see here, especially on the right-hand side, that you can more easily see the fractals that we're creating. So this has to do with the escape value of it. Okay. So in order to create this, I only used one image as a target, and then I used a mathematical function to define my paintbrush over it. Okay. And at the time, we had permission to use this image. This is not the case with all of the other systems that are out there. My students also did an implementation of very similar things inside of an art contest that was held in some of my previous classes back in Russia. Here's some of the finalists that were selected both by students, and then we had a team of artists come in and do a final evaluation. And in fact, the winner of that contest was a big giant monkey picture that actually used this fractal methodology in order to create it. Now, I didn't have a vote. So I'm not saying that my methodology is good, I'm just saying that it won an art contest. Another example of this in my own history, and just recently, was automatic camouflage generation. So this is joint development with Marco Seria at the University of Southern Denmark, and our target was video game textures. So the issue is that many camouflage patterns are copyright. Many images of those are also trademarked. And there's this want for all of these cosmetic loot items inside of like CSGO and other video games. There's also a narrative question in terms of this, of why does everybody look like they're coming out of, the US military if they're on the planet Hoxus, which has a bunch of colored gemstones in the background that are purple and pink and whatever. Maybe we need to create a camouflage for that environment. And so what we did here was create basically an evaluator that mimics a human eye and tries to detect, is that thing camouflaged? And we actually used real military guidelines for how they did some of the testing back in the 1980s of the camouflage uniforms and put that into our system. And so here, for example, is one of our generated patterns. There's the pattern on our test dummy, and that is the test dummy inside of the computer environment in this video game. If you can't see him, he's in the middle. He's camouflaged. If you can't see him, good. Now, you may say, okay, well that's just one pattern. But we also found other patterns that work within this environment that had different values against those. And now we can also change the environment that we're working with and put it on some random planet. The other piece of this is we want to change the blobulator over here, the thing that makes these blobs. And in fact, we could make it look like different types of patterns, triangles, squares, Flecktarn from Germany. We can make it look like that by just changing our representation, and the system stays the same. Okay. So in this case, again, we didn't require the scraping. I didn't put and train it against actual real-world camouflages, which some other systems may do. I only utilized a mathematical function of how I believe the human eye works. Way back in 2009, Bergen and Ross, and Bergen I know because he was in the same classes as me, actually started doing similar types of generations for this. And so they used what they were calling the genetic system. This is user inputs to a target image to the creation. And so it takes a target image, and from that, then generates based on it, just like we did with the Lena example. And so here, for example, is a woman being put together with various circles that it was able to do. And if you make this a little bit further, you can do things like this. So you can take a portrait of someone and, I guess, turn them into something that looks like, I don't know. Anyone know an artist that would produce something like that? Okay. I can see that on the cover of Vogue for some reason. I don't know. So these are really cool generators. They've actually been around, at least in academic circles, 2009. But there's some problems now with art generation. And the big reason has to do with the data set and how they're being trained presently, especially with the issues of art theft. So here is an example that one artist posted of an artistic image that they created, and then this on the other side was a stable diffusion model. That looks remarkably similar, doesn't it? Yes? Okay. If you were a jury of 12 people, if I grabbed 12 of you, would you find for this artist that this is plagiarism and give them, some money for the fact of this? Okay? You're all reasonably intelligent people with an understanding of what's happening inside of the algorithms to some extent, most of you. I would hope. Okay? And even before I explained anything, you went, that looks similar. Okay. This is what a lot of these stable diffusion models are starting to put out. And this is why there's big questions here. To start off with, we have an issue of authorship. Who is the author of an image? Probably the biggest case was a teenage coder whose work was taken and sold at Christie's for nearly $500,000 at the auction house. And this was a Paris collective that he claimed stole his code to do this. Now there's some questions here in this case. I think it was settled, so it was never really brought to bear that this Paris collective was given it to use. But then the question was he giving it to them to sell? And so there's issues here then of who had the right to market the output for this. There's issues with who's the author of this, and who's getting the value of that generative means. The nice thing for Robbie is that a lot of places, upon hearing about this story, started to offer him scholarships and come work for us. So he's probably going to do okay, but, you know, nearly $500,000. Stable diffusion and generators. Many of these generation methods are have huge databases of training data that they're drawing from. And so the question becomes, where do we get those? They form a Markov chain between pixels, so a probability of one pixel being close to another one, the likelihood that one is beside another. And to set these likelihoods, you examine these images and you put tags against them. Right? These might be either visual tags, or they might be like woman, chair, of objects that are in the image. When you prompt then the system with these tags, the pixels of all the images that have that tag can be put into the output of the system. So hence, a model trained with only one image in a tag, if I say put out that tag, it will put out that exact same image. This is where this gets very, very dangerous. And if there's multiple images that have this tag, what you're kind of getting is almost a mosaic between them. You're getting something that is between this image and this image. Okay? And you might have noticed that a lot of these systems have real problems with hands. That's part of this. This is why sometimes these systems put out stuff that looks as if, you know, it's from a garish nightmare of us, and sometimes it puts out something that makes logical sense. Artists also have problems with hands. And so it's interesting to see that the computer is also having the same issues that actual artists have, but for a very different reason. So we have these issues of training against an art style. And if you want to reproduce art in the style of an artist, you feed it with all of the images that you can from that artist. And then you have the diffusion model change other images to look like that. So I get that well-tagged set of images from that artist, I train the model on that art, I give it the prompt, maybe a stick figure with some colors, and then the prompt takes pixels from that artist and puts those pixels down. Artists have had to deal with this before, and I think the biggest illusion here is an issue inside of art called tracing. This is very common inside of the comic and manga fandoms, where people read through and they see the same looking image from different artists, and some of them have been fired over this, where there's been proof of them taking someone else's image and utilizing it. As a professor, I have a term for this as well. It's called plagiarism and academic misconduct. And we have a policy. It's big, it's long, it's scary. It's ED 5-0, which I always thought was funny, since it's the policing policy and it's the 5-0.
5-0.
5-0? Okay.
It's an O.
So let's see some other tracing examples inside the industry. Here's Sonic the Hedgehog, and also Sonic the Hedgehog from two different artists. Here's one from Marvel Comics. Wow, that's 3 different characters. Don't they look like they're in the exact same pose and composition? Okay. That's the same artist for all 3 of those, and it seems like he's just traced over his previous panel work and just put different characters on top of it. And so this is actually a very famous artist, primarily inside of Marvel, known as Greg Land. And it's interesting because sometimes when you read a comic book by Greg Land, you just see a lot of swimsuit models. Well, that's kind of interesting because, yeah, he uses like Sports Illustrated covers inside of his comic books and basically traces them out and does figure drawing with this. This is sometimes quite common for artists to, use figures as what they're drawing, but they don't, put a light box under it and do it. It's interesting sometimes too, you see Boris Karloff there, very famous actor photo, pretty similar in terms of this. We used to have also the term rotoscoping. You might have seen rotoscoped pictures before, in which they would basically do animation over top of humans acting inside of cell framing. This was one of the ways that actually Disney made a lot of their very early stuff with, Snow White dancing. They actually had someone dance, filmed it, and then would draw the cells painstakingly to meet with those actions. There's a bunch of really great YouTube videos as well of showing what my favorite Robin Hood film of all time, the Disney Robin Hood. To me, Robin is a fox. Robin Hood, and taking those images and then comparing it to the Jungle Book and some of the dance scenes in there where you can see that it's the exact same movements being done, and then there's also the film of those dance moves on it. So there's certain amounts of copying inside of the industry. But Greg Land takes this, in many people's estimations, to an extreme. So here is another breakdown of this, where even in this composite image here, you just see a lot of things pop up inside of it that are in previous works. Okay? And he does admit to using images from movies, actors, swimsuit models, and adult media. And every once in a while when you're reading his comic books, you're like, wow, she's really happy. There's also images where you're like, why is Robert Downey Jr. suddenly Iron Man in this comic book? Or why is there famous actors inside of that? And again, it's images coming out of here. So there's been multiple breakdowns of Greg Land's history and videos. There was one by a YouTube channel known as Comic Tropes, where they go through this and show images after images of where this happens. Okay? In the industry, sometimes you gotta make a deadline. Nick Simmons. We might know that last name, right? Detroit Rock City. This is the son of Gene Simmons. And here on the colored panel are from his comic book, and the uncolored panel is from a famous manga series known as Bleach. And Bleach came out before his comic book came out. And not only do you have very similar elements inside of it, you even have similar storylines. So just with Japanese, you read it backwards, so it wasn't there a hole in my chest, and over here, hey, my wound's okay. So very similar even theming inside of this. So why am I highlighting all of these kind of tracings inside of the industry? Well, my question is, are we making a digital Greg Land that is gluing together and collaging all of these elements? Okay. So I'm going to focus in this part on US laws and decisions. I know we're in Canada, but a lot of these companies are US branded, touch that. EULAs usually put the US as the jurisdiction for arbitration. There's easily accessible case law. There's lots of legal commentary. I would check out especially like Leonard French in LawTube. He's actually a copyright lawyer in the US and does this. Full disclaimer, not a lawyer, not legal advice. I'm just commenting upon this as maybe an expert-ish witness potentially in terms of this, but check with your lawyer before believing anything that I say up here. Okay, so usually there's 4 factors that we see inside of a fair use case. The purpose and character of the work, nature of the copyrighted work, the amount or substantially a similarity, and the effect on the potential market for the value of the work. And I just want to go through and take one of these generators and see what are the issues here. Well, first of all, courts tend to favor parody, reporting, commentary, research, teaching, etc. in an application of a fair use case. They also favor works which are transformative, that is, it's adding something new or changing the meaning of the work. These are commercial systems. Might not easily fall under that. Courts also want to protect works that are creative in nature rather than just factual. The works that we're dealing with here are clearly artistic works, which puts it firmly into the idea of something that is more creative than factual. Courts want to protect the entire work, not just pieces of it. You know, if you lose a little bit of this and you glue it in, maybe that's okay. Given that the entire work was part of the data sets used in the training, you're probably having to take the entire work in your creation. And many of these methods are being used to explicitly replace artists. I'm sorry, John, you should have hired an artist and not just used that.
Yeah, but you weren't available at the time.
Yes. Okay. This also brings the question of, can this work even be copyrighted? So there's this idea of a minimal human effort being put into an object. And I work in a lot of generated objects, and there's even questions of, well, if I create a generator and it creates something, do I still own the copyright? And how does that work? So there's this need for a human to be involved in the creation. The Acerthorn case recently really highlights this. So he created what he called the accidental live stream. So it was him bouncing around in his room doing some silly stuff. I really don't care. But he had said in the court filing that it was using to sue other YouTubers. And it was really more of a DCMA thing to kind of like attack other people that were criticizing him. He put in a lawsuit against them, and as part of that lawsuit he said, well, the computer just turned on and started recording. Well, the court ruled because of that, because you said in your case that the computer just started recording and you had no input into it and didn't decide to make this, you don't have copyright. Copyright doesn't exist, it falls into the public domain. Okay? So I press the button on this recording device over here. I would hopefully still have copyright because at least I intended to do it. But if I was just walking into this room and there was a random camera that happened to turn on, I don't own the copyright to that. So the court ruled that since the computer, by the own statements, began on its own, the creation would not fall under copyright. So the mere action of that key press in this decision seemed to be the difference between you have a copyright and don't. Take-Two Interactive, another example of this. There was a lawsuit over tattoos on one of the video game characters. Randy Orton had a big amount of skulls. He was one of the wrestlers inside of this video game. And this had to do with the idea of suspending it in a medium. So even though it was on his body, he didn't have copyright to that image that was on him, and a lawsuit progressed through that. So the question then becomes, with copyright in these generators, beyond just the ethical concerns, it's not clear yet about the legal concerns. So a generator could be trained on images that are under copyright and that are owned. It's unclear whether the copyright would be held. And copyright has both compensatory and statutory damages in the US if it's registered. And as I was doing this, and this morning, there's breaking news. There was a just filed court case, January 13th, Northern District of California, that's the case citation for lawyers in the audience, of a class action suit against scraped images of artists that were on like DeviantArt and a few other places. And their claims were that generators have stolen the market out of this. So what I was theoretically putting together when John asked me to do this presentation is now going to be a court case to watch and see what happens in this. And there was a statement in defense of this in the article that I read, and it got me actually really angry reading it. because it said, anti-AI artists refuse to acknowledge advancements in the technology, instead fight against them like whittlers mad at power tools. Well, power tools don't steal all the whittling I did in order to be power tools. To use a Dremel, I don't have to go and take everybody else's whittling away to do that. And so I think this is a bad conception of what is happening inside of this. And I'm not an anti-AI artist. I am an AI artist. I have publications in this, and I have artistic expressions that I've created using my knowledge of AI. And so I ask then, finally, and I hope this is the challenge to everybody out here, is there a better way? There's presently two dominant means that we, inside of all of these generators and inside of all of these developments inside of AI, we see AI as the controller, the commander, the director. That is, it makes, the mortgage application. It tells us what to do. Computer says no. Computer says yes, and we follow it. And then there's also the AI as the subordinate, the slave, the thing that does what we want. Go make an image, AI. We rarely work with AI systems in a collaborative method. We rarely have communications with AIs where the AI goes, would you like this? Yeah, maybe, but change this. And so that becomes a big question here. And the other piece of this is, how do we get to the idea of an artist exegesis for an AI system? How do we get to the idea that there's an intent inside the AI to make a creation? And so exegesis is the way that a fine artist actually defends their work in an academic setting. So it denotes a critical reading of the work, even a work that's close to the author or the author's own work. And when you do a doctorate in a fine arts degree, there's this question, what is a thesis for a fine arts degree? It's not just, I made a thing. That's not academic enough. It's also, how did you go about making it? What decisions did you make? What's the history of this in terms of it? And so it's marked by then a committee and contains sections about that history, about the process of the creation, about the meaning, the interpretation, why those selections were done. And this gets into the idea also of explainable AI, and where we don't know what these AIs were really thinking when they make these decisions. So I think part of this is also putting it into the idea of an artist's statement with the work. And if you go to museums, you always see that little bit of text by the corner. And sometimes we read that text. A lot of the time we just go, oh, that looks nice. But sometimes we read that text, and that text is there for a reason, to give you the contextualization of what is happening inside of that work. I think we should begin to see the computer program as a medium of expression, as a brush, not as something that's replacing us, but something that we use. And so the human then provides more of the creative selections, the arrangements, which style and colors to use, and we can also lay out in that statement why they selected the tools in question, which algorithms. And since we understand the tool, we then have that creativity enforced by the idea of the human. I think this will also settle some of those legal concerns as well, when we work with them in this way. And I'll give you an example of one of my own works. So this is Lenin and Times. It was published in the Vital Sparks, volume number 2. It's a concrete poem. And in this, it includes an exegesis in which I talk about the history of the Lenin image, as I did today, the algorithm that I selected and used, and why I made the specific choices of font and the target to allow the algorithm to work. So what I hope that you take away is computer art, it's already here. Look on your tables, it's there. We need to be very careful as to how we use these systems, how we relate to them in terms of copyright and attribution. And we can have a far more ethical framework to artistic creation, where we respect the fact that there are these hundreds of thousands of artists that are trapped in this data set. And it's going to require us more to work in concert with the AI, rather than seeing it as something that just takes over. And so I'd like to thank you all for attending today my talk. That's my email, my Twitter there if you have any questions. And I guess I will